Hello, welcome back, everyone. So we will kick off part two of this presentation by talking a little bit about CLIL. And so I'm sure everyone here is intimately familiar with CLIL, but I will go ahead and go through the definition one more time because I honestly did not know what it was when I started working as an ETA. And I just kind of want to set the stage a little bit by talking about one standard definition for this term. The New York Times defines content and language integrated learning as an approach to education in which a subject and a language are taught simultaneously. However, as I came to learn, this can encompass so many things. In some cases, with upper level students or even adult learners of a second language, they're using their second language entirely as the medium through which they're learning about a different subject. In some cases, in Taiwanese schools, this might be an elective class like art or health or music being taught predominantly in English. And these are kind of the examples I had in my head when thinking about what a CLIL class would look like or how exactly I could execute a bilingual class. And then one of the things I realized when I was matched with a host school and started teaching there is that my lovely, wonderful first and second grade students are still grasping, the core letters, the core 26 letters of the alphabet. They're just beginning to differentiate vowels and consonants. They might not be entirely ready for a deluge of English language content covering material that's unfamiliar to them or that they're just still mastering in their first language. So I will be discussing my approach to simple CLIL, or kind of incorporating bilingual education through hands-on activities, storybooks, quizzes or trivia, and other ways to just pepper in more English language education with a subject that students are already being taught, perhaps in Chinese, and that we are looking to make and shift to a bilingual format. And so there are many ways to do CLIL, but this is just speaking from my personal experience, as well as the specific segment of students I was working with. So the overall kind of content pattern or pattern of introducing content that my local English teacher I worked with that I fell into is leading with covering content in Mandarin Chinese and then beginning to talk through and teach through similar materials in English. In our case, my LET would generally introduce a topic and teach directly from the textbook before, and then we would shift into my English language portion of instruction. So we just kind of focused on having basic interactive activities and lessons to encourage students to naturally use English. So we would read storybooks, perhaps sing songs, have trivia games or activities, or otherwise encourage students to begin using basic English words relevant to the content they had just been taught to perhaps describe a situation or respond to very simple questions we would ask them. So this kind of chart that I'll talk through is just a model of how my LET and I began to approach bilingual education and planning the curriculum for our CLIL health class. The adaptability of this specific model may vary depending on if you're working with a foreign teacher, if you're not the sole local English teacher at your school, and perhaps you're working with a team of other Taiwanese educators. But I hope that this can kind of just give an idea of perhaps a jumping off point. If you're beginning to work with a foreign teacher, or maybe if you yourself are interested in transitioning one of the classes you teach into a CLIL format or otherwise integrating bilingual education into it. So in general, I would first meet with my LET, read through a textbook a bit after we had determined how long we're going to spend on each unit, identify some relevant vocabulary terms, create activities, check in, of course, with my LET one more time before we taught them, teach, and then have a wrap up and reflect a bit on what went well and what were areas for improvement with each lesson. So this is a specific example of what my LET and I did to plan these CLIL health classes. She was incredibly amazing and put together a week by week breakdown for the semester for me, of how quickly we needed to move through each unit. And so in some cases we had a wider range of time, particularly if students had a lot of holidays in a given week, or a few weeks or exams coming up. And in those cases, we would need to repeat content sometimes for students who had missed a class because they were, or classes who had missed a lesson because they were taking tests collectively or were off from school. But just sitting down with her even and mentioning, oh, this week students have a long weekend, or oh, this week we need to make sure that students are getting ready for their oral exams for second graders, was very helpful and kind of just helped give me a roadmap of how much time I would have to work with each lesson. Of course, because we needed to plan time for my LET to teach this content in Chinese before then switching into the bilingual segment of it. You can also see here I have some kind of notes early on about maybe specific worksheets or handouts that we would like to cover or preliminary ideas for activities. So after talking with my LET, I would begin to independently read through the textbook. My Mandarin Chinese ability is thankfully at the level where a first grade health or second grade health textbook is appropriately difficult reading material for me. I was learning new vocabulary words while doing this. But perhaps if you're working with a foreign teacher who's a little less confident in their Mandarin Chinese ability, they can also always just grab their phones and use Google Translate to kind of get the gist of a textbook's content. But overall, in addition to just reading for basic understanding of these sentences, I would spend quite a bit of time looking at how information was laid out. In this case, this unit about the five senses would introduce different parts of the body that we use to experience a sense, like our eyes, our ears, and our noses, and then talk a bit about the sense that's generally associated with that body part. For example, this wonderful eye we can see here talking a bit about why it's important to not rub your eyes excessively or make sure your hands are clean before they're getting near your eyes. And that really inspired me perhaps to break down my teaching from just introducing these five senses to asking students to think a little bit more deeply about how they use this sense to interact with the world around them. So the first thing I did was just kind of think at a very broad level, okay, what vocabulary words, if I want to talk about these different body parts and what we use them for, what words do I need to introduce? So it developed into just having the English words see, hear, taste, touch, and smell, and maybe one body part we decided to associate with it: eyes, ears, mouth, nose, and in this case, hand. We also had the word protect because a lot of the textbook focused on teaching students how to protect their eyes, ears, mouth, nose, hands, and keep them safe. While we didn't really delve a lot, in English at least, into how specifically to protect these parts of our body, having that word in there was critical because it let us connect it a little bit more to content that they had previously learned in the textbook. The next thing I did was create activities. So, with an idea of how much time I had and the specific vocabulary words I wanted to cover, I just kind of treated these Google Docs where I'd begin to plan a unit as a space where anything goes. Of course, there's some activities I would create and then talk to my LET and realize they weren't feasible because of their complexity or because they demanded too much time. But this was a really good space for me to just kind of get ideas out there and into the world. And so some of the activities we ended up executing, in this case, the box of terror with hidden items and our tasting foods activity kind of had the seed of those ideas planted here. This is when I started thinking about them and asking my LET about the feasibility of, bringing in a box and trying to hide objects in it, and asking my LET if she also thought we would be able to get enough snacks for 200 kids, or actually close to 100 because this was only first grade students, but ensuring they would all have a taste of a snack we could standardize and prepare in time for each of the classes we would teach. So after that, I would really go in depth and create presentations, worksheets, or preliminary lesson plans for activities. And of course, the most important thing before I moved forward with any of these was talking to my LET. I would send her a copy of presentations I had created or worksheets, and then we would meet one-on-one to discuss them. In certain cases, this was extremely useful because it helped me identify last minute typos I had made when typing in Chinese, which would have further confused my students. Or in certain cases, reminding me, oh, this activity is good, this looks promising, can you expand it a little? And my LET would challenge me to consider maybe how I could stretch an activity further, or how I could build in lessons learned and vocabulary learned in previous units into these upcoming health classes. And the last step of this process was wrap up and reflections. After these CLIL health lessons, whether I felt they had gone exceptionally or perhaps had areas for improvement, my LET and I would talk through what we thought had been our takeaways from that lesson. If we thought perhaps there was areas in which students were becoming confused about a topic or might need a little more explanation, if there were areas where we saw perhaps a game or an activity was designed for one student at a time to complete in front of the class, but more students wanted to engage, how to make these activities really aimed at the whole of class instead of having one or two students at a time experience them, so on and so forth. Carving out these times to identify what we had enjoyed about a CLIL lesson and what we maybe wanted to work on a little bit for next time was critical, and I felt really helped to improve the how engaging our lessons were as the year went on. So here are some examples of CLIL lessons that we taught. So there was a unit in our second grade students' health textbook about recycling. What we decided to do is a fairly straightforward adaptation of what they were learning. So teaching them about how to sort trash by demonstrating the names of each category of recyclable in English, as well as how to say trash in general. We had a presentation along with it where I would introduce perhaps differences in recycling in the United States and Taiwan, after which my LET would translate a bit and check in to make sure students were following and understanding the curriculum and vocabulary as we taught. And concluding with an activity where we had these terms written in English and Chinese on the board, and we asked students to help us sort a bag of trash, which were recyclables my LET had collected and washed, but the students found immensely fun. Here are some of the students determining, in one case, I would put things into different recycling containers and ask them if I had sorted them correctly. Here you can see some of the students are very excited to tell me that I had not, in fact, um, learned from my CLIL health class and had put, I think, paper into the plastic container. Oh no. And in this class, in this photo on the right, I'm watching a student from this class right before he correctly sorts trash. You can tell he's having fun, and the entire class also became engaged in making sure that I think the glass bottle that he was holding went into the right container. Here is another unit we had for grade 2 health students, talking about healthy teeth. So at first we went through fairly straightforward vocabulary, tooth, teeth, toothpaste, toothbrush. And after we had really laid down that vocabulary and made sure students had a firm understanding of each word, we had a matching game where students were simply tasked with identifying pairs of cards that had these words and terms written on them. Next, we had a very brief storybook using these same words: tooth, toothbrush, toothpaste, but adding in perhaps specific parts of this mouth, the mouth of this character is brushing the front, back of the teeth. So as I talked through the book, we would invite students up and ask them to brush with us. I would ask a student, can you brush the front of the teeth, the back? Can you brush the left? Can you brush the right? Which our students really love taking part in. This is a bit more about the five senses unit. So after introducing, of course, a specific maybe part of the body and the sense associated with it, we would open our classes by asking students if they remembered what the five senses were, or if they could name the parts of the bodies that went along with each. Our students really loved this, and so by the end of this kind of introductory part of the course, after they had been taught all this content in Chinese and beginning to be taught it in English, they really got quick at responding to us: eyes, ears, mouth, nose, hand, hear, see, smell, taste, touch. So from there, given how quickly our students are picking things up, we decided to kind of be a bit more ambitious with what we were teaching. We focused on two senses, taste and touch. Here for taste, I taught students about saying a food was sweet, salty, bitter, or sour, also showing them foods associated with each taste. And then, after really kind of establishing the connections between a taste and its English name, we asked our students to help us identify different tastes. We prepared some small snacks and had our students, after reviewing the PowerPoint one more time, try and identify which snack was associated with which taste. This is the worksheet that they had. We used an image of each snack that they had had, as well as the four terms we had taught them. In this case, some very dark chocolate that was bitter and not sweet at all, a lime, some sweet candy, and then some salty and unsweetened popcorn. In another case for touch, we had students guess what an item hidden in a box was. The students could not see what this item was until the end of class, where we would take off the top of the box and show everyone what had been inside of it. We also varied the item each class to keep things fresh for our students. So here, after kind of talking through the role of touch as a sense, I asked students to learn or repeat these simple adjectives after me so we could begin discussing how we would describe different touches or different feelings that we might experience through touch. So, in certain cases, if we had a stuffed animal, a student might circle, oh, this thing feels soft, it feels small. Or if we had, in one case, also, I think, a water bottle that I had brought in, it felt cool to the touch because it was metal. It felt dry, but students could hear maybe some water sloshing around in it. And at the bottom, they also had an opportunity to write in English or Chinese, whichever they were more comfortable with, their guess about what had been hidden in the box. Here are some more reflections I have, just kind of as a wrap up for this CLIL component. And again, depending on time, you can perhaps reflect on these individually or in a small group or breakout room with other teachers. What subjects would you feel most comfortable teaching in a CLIL setting or a classroom? Would you teach these classes alone or in partnership with a second teacher? What kinds of activities do you think your students would find most engaging? They respond well to storybooks? Are they competitive and do they love games that are team-based or trivia-based? Or are your students really, really hands-on and do they prefer to have an example, have an opportunity to, for example, brush a set of teeth in front of the class or try and sort recycling? Are you concerned about any of these provided examples being too easy for your students and thus unengaging or too difficult? And how textbook dependent is your course planning? We, of course, had to get through each health class's textbook content before we could kind of get into these activities, but perhaps you have more or less wiggle room. That can also determine how much time you're able to spend drafting up multiple CLIL activities for one lesson, or if you can really focus on having these engaging bilingual activities maybe be a wrap up that takes up a week of that lesson or of that class. So thank you all for your time and for the opportunity to speak to you today. If you would like to see any of the presentations I prepared for these bilingual health classes or camp more in depth, please feel free to reach out to me. I will be leaving Taiwan at the end of July, but I would be happy to share the materials I have. And if you have more specific questions about perhaps working with a foreign teacher to deliver bilingual learning, please feel free to reach out to me as well. Thank you all for your time, and I hope you have an amazing day.